bit longer than expected, and I really want to keep these time frames reasonable. So without counting that second example, if you did watch the second example of the competitor rate making, feel free to watch it again if you want to be really entertained, or if you're maybe probably more if you have insomnia. But really, we're going to cover the real basics of the special topic. So we're going to cover kind of the bare bones, basic increased limits rate making and basic deductible rate making. They're really essentially kind of the same thing, where you're limiting your losses, or limits are limiting losses at the high end, and deductibles are limiting somewhat or subtracting losses at the low end. So I'm now trying to find the actual slide here. See all slides. So we're going to jump down to chapter. There it is. Chapter 11. We're going to do increased limits rate making. We're not going to cover this whole presentation. I'm going to send the whole presentation in case you do want to read about it, or maybe some of you have internships with PNC insurance companies, and you want to take a look. Feel free to reach out about anything here. I will also send I'll send the full Excel, but you will only be responsible officially on an exam for basic increased limits rate making and basic deductible rate making to the extent that we are showing in today's class. Okay, so increased limits rate making, what are they? So insurance products provide protection against third-party claims, third-party liability claim. This would be bodily injury. If you injure somebody, that's loss, hospital bills, lost wages, things like that. Or it is also property damage, typically the damage to another vehicle for an accident that you caused, but it could be damage to other types of property also, running into a house or running into a stop sign or something like that. Most products start at low limits, so there are minimum limits that a company has to offer. Usually, the state recommends that. Say for property damage, might be, or bodily injury could be $25,000. That you buy that much coverage. Typically, with the fact that hospital bills could go into the six figures, many insurers typically want more protection than just that $25,000. So this is strictly a severity game. You want to cover for your more severe losses. So there's two types of limits. There are single limits, which are the total amount an insured will pay for any one claim. So if your limit's $25,000, it only covers claims up to $25,000. I think we talked about this before, maybe even in our first initial classes. So if you buy $100,000, that means a company will pay up to $100,000, or $300,000, or $5 million theoretically, if you want to get some really large liability policy. I think that's the umbrella policies, as we talked about in our first class. Compound limits are a little bit different. So there's a couple ways you can do it. There's per claimant and per accident. So for example, it's easy just to say, for an example, the first amount covers how much they will cover for losses for any one individual. So $100,000 could be that number, say. And then per accident is $300,000. So it covers no more than $1,000 per individual, and then no more than $300,000 for the total of all claimants in one event. And even though it's a factor of 3, it can be more than 3. So, if you have 4 people that have $50,000 each in losses, $50,000 times 4 is only $200,000. So even though it's under the $100,000 for each individual, and it's under the $300,000 for each accident. So if you run into a car with 4 or 5 occupants, you could be fully covered. Version 2 is per claim and per policy aggregate. This is more common in larger commercial. So you'll charge $1 million for any one claim, but then for the whole policy period, you can't get more than $3 million. So you could have a bunch of small claims, If you have 4 claims of $1 million, you're not going to cover for that third. You're not going to cover for that fourth claim. Because it'd be 4 claims over the course of the policy period. So you could exhaust your $3 million limit right away, or you may not exhaust it through the entire policy period. Most of the time, you're going to pick an amount that you're not going to exhaust because you don't want to cause that much risk to your business. So those are called the split limits or compound limits. Before you do this, you should always make sure your losses are developed. You don't need to trend your losses because your trend factors, we'll see this is a quotient, and your trend loss are the same. The trends will just wash out. But you have to develop your losses before starting because it's very important that you use ultimate values and not partial values. So the procedure is actually very straightforward. I remember people did really well on these for the exam. These are actually, pay attention if you like easy exam questions to kind of clean up, because I think the increased limits and deductibles were, people did pretty well on them typically. So the procedure is calculate your limited annual severity for each layer of loss. And a layer of loss is to say, I think, like 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, that's a layer. And then your ILF is the limited severity for that layer divided by the limited severity for the base. I have a derivation, which I'm not going to go over for the sake of time. But I think when you do the example, you kind of get the idea of what we're doing. So we could, if you want me to sketch this out schematically during office hours, I'm happy to do it. But for the sake of time, like I said, I don't want these to go too terribly long. I shouldn't be recording 4.5 hours of videos for a 3-hour class. So I'm going to try to cover these a little bit more cursorily, but I think you'll still get the idea. So let's go through an Excel demo of what a problem would look like. So you have here your you have your size of loss. So you have a min and a max. So these are your sizes, or from, I should say from and to. Okay. Okay, so let's go through this in a little bit of detail here. So any loss that was from 0, or I guess it would be from 1. There's no such thing as a $0 loss. From 1 to $100,000. So any loss that was in $1 to $100,000, you had 2,324 claims, and you had about $117 million in change in those losses. So any loss that was from that amount to this amount, you had this many claims and this many losses. If you had losses from $100,000 to $250,000, you had 1,923 claims that were in this class, that were in this amount here, and you had $300 million or so of losses. All the way up to losses that were from $500,000 to $1 million. There weren't many of them. There were 73, but they still cost quite a bit of money for not having many claims, $43 million, because they're all very big losses. Okay, so now you need to figure out your limited annual severities. How did you calculate your limited annual severities, or LAS, if you like? What am I doing? Your limited annual severities. Okay, I'm going to sketch through this, and then we'll go through the other two. Okay, so if you limited all losses to $100,000, what we're saying is if you limit all losses to $100,000, what would these losses look like? So if you had a severity limitation of $100,000, well, in these losses that only went up to $100,000, you'd have everything. If you limit our loss to $100,000, obviously, all these losses would be included, right? So if you limited your losses in this layer, any losses that were from $100,000 to $250,000, well, some of these, you wouldn't be this whole amount because these losses, some of these dollars are for that amounts over $100,000, right? So if you limited your losses, your limited severity here is just your claims times your loss amount, right? 1,923 times the loss amount, or a total of 192,000 or 192 million. I apologize, $300,000. So on and so forth. If you had a limited annual severity of, if you limit our losses to $100,000, your any loss just for these 680 losses would be limited by 100,000, $16 million. Same thing for these big losses. Obviously, you're going to be taking out quite a chunk of these big losses because these are all losses that were $500,000 to $1 million. So only 73 million or 7.3 million of the 43 million total lost dollars. So what happens then? You add them up, $385 million dollars in losses. So your limited annual severity means the limited, so your all your losses now. If you limit all your losses to $100,000, you would have $385 million worth of losses out of your total of $691 million. So if you're drawing a schematic, you would take off you would take off this whole layer of losses here. And your limited annual severity then is, your severity is again losses divided by number of claims. So $385 million, 385 million-ish divided by 500,000 comes out to be 77,046. So your limited annual severity is $777,000. I apologize. This were a podcast, I probably would. I would go back and redo it, but it's not, so you'll have to bear with me. Okay, let's do $250 million now. I think you'll start to see a pattern here when we do these other layers. So now let's forget the $100,000 even was there. Now we are limiting our losses now to saying, okay, what would our total losses be if we limited the losses to $250 million or $250,000? Well, first things first. In this layer of 0 to 1,000, you take them all, right? Because if you limited your loss to $250,000, none of these guys here would pierce the limit. Second, you limited your losses to $250,000. None of these losses also would pierce the limit. You're $307 million. So you need all the dollars. Now, what would happen here? Every one of these losses would pierce the limit. So the losses for these limited to $250,000 now is 250,000 times the number of claims. 680 claims, $170 million. Same thing here. The limited losses of 250 would be 73 claims times 250 grand, 18,250. Or 18,250,000. It's getting late for me. You add up your losses, so now it's $613 million now out of this. So your loss limit would be, your limited annual severity would be now this number divided by 500 grand or $122,000. Let's take a look at these. Let's take a look at the characteristics here again to get what I call the smell test here. Should be always lower than your limited annual severity. And it should get decreasingly, they should get a little closer together. So this is what, 77%, that's about half. Let's do this again at $500,000. Once again, what if we limit all the losses to $500,000? Well, you'd include all the losses here, right? In the first layer. You'd include all the losses in the second layer. And now what about this layer? You would include all the losses now in this $500,000 layer as well. Think about just a layered cake. If we limit our losses to $500,000, you would include 73 times 500,000. So it should be most of them. Whoops, didn't have my commas here. Add them all. So add them all up again. now you're talking almost every loss, 685 million over 691, which you should expect. Your limit annual severity, losses divided by claims. And now you are at, notice how you're only at $137,000. That's almost the same as $250,000 because most losses, not many, you don't have a whole lot of losses above. And this is a pretty typical distribution. It's very typical to have a distribution something like this, where the closer you get to a higher layer, the fewer losses that you have. One thing I think is kind of neat pointing out, and you can really see the concept here of layers. Let's take a look now at the losses. What calculations do we actually just take the losses? Which do we actually limit the losses? So I'm going to color the cells based on the losses and the limited losses. This is really where you can kind of see a little schematic of the layers. So there's different layers of losses. Each limited annual severity takes more layers of the actual losses, and then from the other layer, you just kind of pierce the top. These are the ones where you're skimming off the top of the losses are the ones that are in orange, and the ones that you're keeping the full losses are the ones in blue. I think that's very instructive. Okay, so what would we be charging then if we were doing limited annual severity? Yeah, basically, so let's go back to our PowerPoint here. Our limited annual severity is the ILF, the loss for the layer, the limited annual severity for the layer, divided by the limited annual severity for the base. So our base here is, your base is, it could be anything, but we'll say our base is our lowest layer. So our limited annual severity, I'm just going to put, so it's easier it's easier calculating them when you have them all here. This is it, sorry. So your limit annual severity is your, I copied them to the wrong cell. So your increased limit factor then is your LAS for the layer divided by LAS for the base, right? So your LAS for the layer is 122,000 divided by 77,000, or 1.59. 122 divided by 77. So if your base rate was $100,000 for BI or for whatever this layer, it'd be $159 to increase your increased limit to $250,000. So what would my LAS then be for $50,000? It's your LAS for 137 divided by your LAS for your base. Oops, or 1.78. So if your premium were, if it was $100, be $159 and $178 to get $500,000 of coverage. It's amazing how cheap it is to purchase additional layers of coverage. But that's actually, and even though it seems like, man, that's not a lot of that's not a lot of extra money for that much protection, because typically that much protection in most cases is not going to be needed. Most of the losses stay below, the vast majority of claims, stay below the minimum. It's only a small amount of claims that typically goes higher than the minimum. Okay, let's do this. Let's do this one more time. I'm just going to recopy this down below here. And how do I do this again? There we go. Okay, we have a couple different layers now. 0. We have 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, and In this case, we go all the way up $300,000 to unlimited or $1 million. So let's go over the same calculation. I'm going to go over these a little bit more quickly for the sake of time. Our limited annual severity, what losses in this layer here, the 0 to 100, any losses that fell into these fall into 100,000. All of them again, right? What losses fall into the $100,000 layer here? Again, 100,000 times the number of claims, because anything else is excess. What losses fall into the $300,000? Fall into the $200,000 to $300,000 layer. What losses fall of 100,000 fall into the 203,000? 100,000 times. So what you really have to do is, whoops, my bad there. Number of claims, not number of losses. That's 62 billion. It's not that much. And the exact same thing applies here. 100,000 times 43. Did that again. Sorry, I'm too lazy to edit. It's also amazing it takes actually more time to record a class than it does actually to conduct the class, because you can edit and go back and pause. Okay, so our total losses, so the total losses that fall into the $100,000 layer are $172 million of the 282,000. We'll do the 200,000 quickly. You would take just your reported losses for any layer below 200,000, and 200,000 times, I'm going to do this so you can see how I can do this a little more quickly in Excel, times the amount of claims, and then the exact same thing for here. We're going to take the reported loss for the 300,000. So it's a total losses of anything that falls under 300,000 times the amount of claims times 300 grand. Yeah, I did it right this time. You add up your totals right here. This is your base, ILF. So your base is 1. I'm sorry, your base here will be 1. Your reported losses are, my apologies, are $175,000. So again, this is your base. Your 1 is your base. So 200,000 is essentially your, your ILF divided by your LAS for the base divided by the LAS for the layer divided by LAS for the base, and then your LAS for the $300,000 layer is 264,000, 264 million divided by. I'm sorry, I didn't divide it by. I think it's actually the same calculation, but I prefer the limit annual severity. There we go. I like the severity because I think it's easy, it's more relatable, but I think the calculations are the same actually. I like the limit annual severity because you can actually see it increasing, and you can kind of make sure it passes the test here, because you can compare the 300,000 to the 102,000 instead of these big nebulous gargantuan loss amounts. So your LAS is 673, 67,000, 96,000, 102,000. This is one reason why these losses don't go 1, 2, 300. Look how close these premiums are. $100, $144. I like using a base of 100. It's only $9 more to go from 200 to 300. There's almost no price differential at all. So people just won't vary their selection. And sometimes it's easier for claims people or whatever to not have different losses, or it's easier for regulators and things like that too. But so these are your loss development factors. You take your layers. Notice you can do algebraically, they work out to be the same. I prefer the limited annual severity. I kind of took the shortcut because I was trying to go too fast. So as John Wooden said, be quick but don't hurry. I was unfortunately hurrying rather than trying to be quick. So your LAS is 667,000, 96,000, 102,000. And please don't say who's John Wooden. If you want to know, make sure you Google him. He was a basketball coach back in the 1960s and 70s, one of the most famous coach of all time. Him and Coach K, I guess. Hopefully you don't have any questions. If you do, like I said, I'll have additional office hours. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. If there's something you just flat out don't understand, the hard thing for doing this for video is I have no feedback from you at all. I can't see your heads nodding or puzzled looks on your faces, or you just flat out can't raise your hand. So, like I said, feel free to reach out if you have any questions, because I appreciate your doing this over video, because like I said, my schedule does not allow me to teach on Tuesday the 15th. So that's it for limited annual severity for this particular purpose. There is one more thing. I will just cover it really briefly. So this is nice if you have all perfect data. This assumes we have losses on every single raw loss that we have. But unfortunately, if you have a limit, if your insurance has a limit of $100,000, we're not going to have any data for a loss that actually pierces the limit. So if you had a limit of $100,000 and there was a loss that pierced, we'll go back to our data here. There's a loss that pierced $175,000. I'm including it here, actually. But if the insured had a limit of $100,000, you don't take data on that, because you're only taking data, or only having data on the losses that you actually paid out at $100,000 if there's a limit. So this assumes you have perfect data, but the limit's $100,000. There's likely no data, because the insurer's not going to bother to estimate it, because they don't have to pay it. So it's still straightforward to do the base limit. Limited annual severity for higher layers is way more complex, because you can't use a policy that has a lower limit, because we don't know the claim amounts. There's a whole lot of mumbo jumbo and calculation that you can do it. For the sake of time, we are not going to do it here. If you would like to look at it on Excel, I do kind of step it out in Excel. I'm not going to do that example today. We are going to shift strictly toward deductibles and spend maybe 15 to 20 minutes on deductibles, and then video 4 is just a couple of mostly just some administrative things, and then you can call it a day. But you can actually call it a day whenever you want to, because we're on video. So, so what is a deductible, and why do we have it? A deductible, one reason is it reduces the rate for the customer. So having a deductible is saying the insured has a limit for which they are responsible. So if I have a $500 homeowner's deductible, the company will not pay me any money for any losses that are less than $500. So if I did not have that, I could turn in a $2 claim. If I had rain, something happened with the rain, and it just put a little dent in something, or a little dent in my house, or something cost $2, or I lost something, a piece of personal property got damaged, that was $10, I could make a $10 claim to the insurance company. So it eliminates those small nuisance claims. And then also the cost of adjusting the claim. So the cost of adjusting that $10 claim could be $200, and why would the company even want to bother to pay it? So that would be a huge expense for the company. It would be passed along to the customer. So it does cause the premium reduction. It also provides incentive for loss control. If I didn't have a deductible, if I had a $0 deductible, I turn every claim in. Why the heck should I ever want to prevent losses? Or even for larger claims, if I was on the hook for a deductible, say $500, there is incentive for me to protect my property, because I will have to pay the first $500 deductibles of a claim. It also can control, in some ways, control a catastrophic exposure. I don't fully agree with that, which you'll see in a second, but it does limit the total amount of losses. Though if there's a catastrophe with a whole lot of claims or a whole lot of large claims, it does limit it by all that much, because the deductible is usually a small percent of the total possible loss. There is a belief among people, especially among underwriters, that if you want to help your company's losses, just raise deductibles. So raise a $500 to $1,000, or raise $1,000 deductible to $2,500 deductibles. Problem solved. You have just reduced your company's losses. That's actually not a good idea. You are lowering your pure premiums because certainly you are making the customer on the hook for more lost dollars. But why is it not a good idea? So first of all, when you the higher deductibles, the lower the premiums because you are selling less coverage. If you raise deductibles from a low number to a high number, it reduces coverage, it reduces income for the company, and it reduces income for your sales agents, meaning it reduces their commissions. So why is selling less of your product ever a good thing? So you're controlling your losses, but you're also decreasing your premiums. It's also increased risk for the company. So remember when we did, we talked about risk, we talked about like underwriting profit provision and how you should have greater profits for higher variance. Well, getting rid of all those so you're getting rid of a lot of like smaller claims. So maybe if you increase deductibles from $500 to $1,000, yeah, you'll get rid of all those $750 claims, say. But increasing your severity and lowering your frequency results in higher volatility of experience because you're getting rid of that larger amount of smaller claims that helps your variance. So you will have to charge more for profit provision and thus become less competitive on your prices. And then your risk become a lot harder to price. Remember we said the more expected claims, you have more credibility. So you're lowering your amount of expected claims, meaning you're going to decrease the credibility of your own data, meaning it's going to be harder to price your business. You would much rather have a lot of claims to price, a lot of claims to use in your pricing analysis, and then you will have more accurate prices. So why do you want to sell less of your product for a lower premium, increasing your risk to the company, increasing your variance of losses, increasing your volatility, and making your pricing less accurate because you have less data to price on? You're going to lower your pure premium, but you're going to, you're going to make other things harder. So you're trading one problem, you're solving one problem, and you're causing two or three others. So the solution is offer options to your customers. It's better service to offer them more things that they could buy. So, offering, if people want smaller deductibles, you can price for them. You can price for $100 deductible if you want. Even if you want to load in a little bit of extra pricing because there's more claims, you can figure that out. And if you're smart, you can estimate that. And maybe your deductible factor for $100 would be a little bit higher than you would offer for a loss. But that's my deductible sermon. I think that's something if you're for P&C actuaries really need to make sure that they understand because you get people who just strictly underwrite based on pure premium. So I don't want a 16-year-old driver because they cost a lot more in lost dollars. Well, if you can get a price for them, write all the 16-year-old drivers that you want if you think you get an accurate price. Oftentimes the problem is you can't get an accurate price. Okay, so that sermon aside, let's talk about deductibles and what we have is called a loss elimination ratio, kind of limit annual severity, but instead of limiting losses, you're eliminating them from the bottom. Okay, the cool thing about this is the loss elimination ratio. It looks a lot like your deductible. I'm not going to derive it for the sake of time, but really it is the losses in LAE eliminated by the deductible divided by the total ground up losses in LAE. So rather than doing the limits of losses, we're taking them off the bottom now. We're going from ground up to eliminated by the deductible. Some considerations, again, we had this the whole thing with the censoring losses in that you may not know all of your losses. So someone with a $500 deductible The $350 loss will not be logged in the data. So that's a problem. If that's the case, you just couldn't use policies greater than the deductible. That's not as bad of a problem as the censoring losses. And a big one is the claim reporting that each deductible will be the same. So sometimes if somebody has a loss, say you have a $500 deductible and a $510 loss, you may not even turn that claim in to get a $10 check from your company. Companies have claims surcharges and things like that, so you may be advised not even to bother turning in that claim. And some people may just, they'll just pay it themselves and not even, like I said, it's not worth bothering for $10. So small losses above the deductible may not be reported. So you're assuming, you're making some assumptions that may not be perfect, but again, that's it. It's just what you have. And also, low risk insureds may choose higher deductibles too. Sometimes that difference is ignored, but oftentimes other rating variables, it'll flow through into other rating variables. So if there are a certain type of people, if there are certain types of age or house amount, that could just kind of flow into the pricing for that class. That's where multivariate pricing helps. Whoops. Okay, so this is the last thing for this one video is the loss elimination ratio. So I will also show you the ILF censored DT. If you want to go through the ILF, look at the ILF censored. It does actually step through everything if you want to take a look at censored losses. Again, for the sake of time, I like to go through it, but I do want to be respectful of time and amount of material. I think we're about 2.5 hours right now total. Okay, so loss elimination ratio. What does all that mean? So let's do this. Let's look at this first column here. Losses eliminate. So now, rather than saying before, so the ILF, we said limit annual severity. So we limited all losses to $100,000. Deductibles, we just say what losses are eliminated by $100. So first of all, we look at our size of loss. Look at all the losses less than $100. We have 3,200 of them. From a ground-up standpoint, there are $240,000. So if we eliminated all the $100 losses, we eliminate the whole shebang here, right? Eliminated the entire $100. The loss eliminated by $100 here for the layer now, the loss layer losses more than 100, less than 250. We have 1,225 claims for a total of $207,000 in losses. If we eliminated all $100, the losses that are eliminated now are just $100 times the amount of claims, right? And so on and so forth. So the losses eliminated by the layer 250 to 500 is 1,187 times that, then 1,845 times 100, and then anything greater than $1,000, 2,500 claim. This is the lion's share of the losses, because most of the losses aren't that typically small, or at least the losses that are higher are typically a lot higher. So you sum them up. Then you have what's called your loss elimination ratio. Your loss elimination ratio is 0.68. So if you limit losses, if you take $100 off every loss, you eliminated 6.8% of the losses. Okay, let's do the example of 250. And you're going to see the same type of thing. Remember how we had this whole this little stair step thing here, because the losses where we just strictly took the whole layer itself, and the loss where we had to do some calculations to the layer because we had to chop something from the losses. The exact same thing is going on here. So the losses we eliminate by 150,000 versus the losses that we have to take $100 $100 away from the losses. Exact same thing happens here. Whoops, wrong color. I'll just cheat and use this. We eliminate losses by $250. We take each layer, though, we take the full layer of all the way up to $250, and we take a portion of the layer, the $250 portion of the layer, for the other claims. This one should not be blue. I apologize. Make this not green. We're already using green. Use gray. Does everybody see what we're doing here? Hopefully you do. You add, and then so you add up the losses. It'll be eliminated 13.5% of the losses from going to from going to $250,000. We eliminated $1.8 million of loss of the total of $1,300 of the losses. That's what the loss elimination ratio is. Just the ratio of losses eliminated. So if you do $500, I'm going to just okay. So same thing. If you eliminate $500, your LER for $500. You take the full amount of losses up to the limit, or up to the top of up to the layer, and then the portion of the losses from any losses that penetrate the layer, and the exact same thing for $100,000 or for $1,000. Excuse me. You take everything under the layer and everything that penetrates the layer. You get your totals, and then you divide by your ground up losses again to get your loss elimination ratio. 5,000 or 5 million divided by 13.6 million is $36.8. Then your deductible relativity finally is 1 minus your LER. So you should be charging the premium then. So the $100 deductible. So your base, you're assuming your base is 0. Your $100 deductible is eliminating 6.8% of the losses, so I should be charged only 93.2% of the premium, because you should be charged only for the losses that you're eliminating. You're assuming, of course, the base is all losses because you have them all. So for $1,000 premium, $1,000 premium, you should be charging, my bad here. Let me make this a little easier for you to read. So for $1,000 premium, for example, you should charge $932 for a $100 deductible. And what did I do here? Oh, I just hit the wrong layer. It's been a long day. That's better. $632 for a $1,000 deductible. So the premium should go down because you're providing less coverage. You're providing coverage only for losses over $1,000 and only for layers of loss that go over $1,000. So you should be charging a lower premium commensurate to the amount of losses that you eliminate. That's all there is to deductible pricing. It is actually fairly straightforward. The calculations aren't bad. The calculations are really the same thing as is done for increased limits factors. You're just taking the layer and you are dividing by you're multiplying by the additional portion for ILFs, or the losses that you're adding. The layers are the layers that you're eliminating for deductibles. So really, essentially the same concept. So I believe that takes us to the end. Make sure there's nothing else left. Nope. That takes to the end of video 3. We have just a couple of things for video 4, a couple of housekeeping items. And I wanted to go over one homework problem that a lot of you had trouble with for the exam. So once you're ready to watch video 4, feel free to flip it on YouTube. So thanks to everyone.